Shalom Aleichem. Good evening, and welcome back to Tom's Talmud TISCH. Today we're going to be doing some family history. We'll dig deep into the early periods of our national saga. And quite fascinatingly, things that happened a really long time ago had influence on events that unfolded much, much later. I see some of you signing in now, and I want to remind all of you that should you have questions, you can pose them on the chat, in the live chat on YouTube. If you're watching on Facebook, I'd encourage you to move over to YouTube, and as such, you'll be able to fully participate. So as I'm getting all this forum open, I have to tell you that when I was first working on this Gemara, I had a very difficult time. Things did not seem to make sense to me. Not because I couldn't understand the Gemara, and the Gemara is fairly straightforward, and the pshat isn't impossible to wrap your head around. What was the Gemara trying to say, though? What was the Gemara looking for? I mean, what does this have to do with the story of the Megillah? And why would the sages, speaking about the Megillah, focus on an event that has like this remote, faint connection to the story of Purim? Like, how does it explain the Megillah? There are so many arcane teachings like this. Why did this one get included in the collection of the sermons that the sages delivered, specifically with regard to Megillah Esther? So these are some of the questions that I had. And I have to tell you that once I introduce the Gemara to you, I think you'll have the same questions. The good news is that I also think I have an answer. I see Mrs. Weber is asking, how did Mordechai become an important figure in the Persian government? That's a really good question. I think the simple answer is a great miracle happened there. And on the level of what we would call nature, Mordechai was the person who saved the king's life. And his niece or cousin, Esther, was the queen. And after the story of Purim, the king had a great deal of trust in Mordechai. And Haman was deposed, and the timing was perfect. Does that really make sense? Does it really explain why Mordechai rose to greatness? I'm not so sure. If you ask me, it's a miracle. That's the real answer. Any other questions before we begin? No other questions for tonight yet. I'm looking forward to getting your questions. If you're following along inside the Gemara, I encourage you to turn to Daf Tet Zayin. This is going to be a page turner. We're going to begin on the very bottom of this large page with a lot of Gemara in it. It's page 16, Masechet Megillah, and we'll turn the page quickly enough and end up on Tes Zayin Amud Beis, 16, side B. So with no further ado, welcome to Family History. We've been analyzing different verses in the Megillah. And I want to remind you of a general thesis that emerged over the course of our studies in Masechet Megillah, our sages wanted to highlight the extraordinarily miraculous nature of exactly what Miss Weber was asking. How did Mordechai, in fact, become such an important person in the Persian government? How did things work out just right? And the answer is it's not nearly as simple as it looked. The nature of the Megillah is to somewhat obfuscate or camouflage the presence of Hashem. The nature of studying the Megillah, begin with listening to the story carefully, but also to delve into the Megillah as we're doing right now, is that we begin to realize just how miraculous, just how wondrous, just how remarkable a story this was. In the episodes prior to tonight, we've emphasized time and again how what seems to be a small tremor, maybe a hairline crack in the grammar, syntax, diction, or the actual facts of the story of the Megillah are really much more. It's like the tip of the iceberg. And as we went on to study line after line, sugya after sugya, topic after topic, I think we discovered in stunning color how true this really was. The big minority report shows up this week. The Gemara does not quote a verse from the Megillah at all. In fact, the Gemara begins to quote verses of the Torah, taking us back to the 45th chapter of Genesis. This is the story of Joseph and his brothers. Joseph and his brothers being reunited after a long, painful separation. Joseph's brothers sold him into slavery. And little did they know that the draconian prime minister they were dealing with was actually their brother. And then, in a moment of extraordinary drama, after Joseph frames his baby brother Binyamin, the only one who is not part or parcel of Joseph's sale, the one with whom Joseph shared both parents, for Binyamin alone was his brother from both father and mother. Then Joseph, seeing Yehuda, representing the rest of the brothers, prepared to fight to the death and do anything to rescue Binyamin, realizes that they have come to regret their errant ways. So Yosef reveals himself. And it's a very tearful reunion. It's quite shocking for his brothers. And he reassures them. He says to them, don't even think about it. It doesn't matter what you intended. What matters is that I'm the prime minister now, and I can provide for the family. I was sent on a mission. And then Yosef gifts his brothers with suits of clothing. So our Gemara, on the very bottom of page Tezayin, opens up with a quote from this verse. L'chulam, meaning to all of his brothers, Nosan le'ish chalifos simolos. To each of his brothers, he gave suits of clothing. Now, suits of clothing, there's differences of opinion, whether this was a tunic and a robe or, like they say, three-piece suit, jacket and pants, whatever it was. Probably, I don't think they were pants at that time, but it was what was ever needed, like a full wardrobe. Ule Binyamin, but to his brother Benjamin, Nosan chomesh chalifos. The Torah says he gave 5 suits of clothing. And this is the question that the Gemara poses. Something's wrong here. Yosef, who's in the midst of reconciliation. He's trying to heal the family that had become broken. Broken because of their jealousy for Yosef, which mushrooms into full-throated animosity and even hatred. Ultimately, they are convinced, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that Yosef is a danger to the future of the nascent nation called Israel. He thinks he knows what he's doing, they said. He believes that he is the heir, the spiritual heir of Jacob. But he will lead our people astray. And in their self-righteous anger, they believe the right thing to do was to rub him out, eliminate him. Now, we're not really talking about the sale of Joseph, and I'm not going to try and defend it. It was a horrific, terrible thing, and you'll hear more about that tonight. But Joseph's trying to mend fences now. He has seen that his brothers did tshuva. He seeks no vengeance, but instead extends the olive branch, proverbially speaking, in the form of gifts. And he gives Binyamin 5 times the gift he gave everybody else. No. So what's the obvious question? The obvious question is, says the Gemara, Efsher, is it possible, Davar shenitztair by oisay tzaddik, something that caused so much pain, so much suffering, so much dispossession for this righteous man, Yosef, that Davar shenitztair by oisay tzaddik, says Rashi, La'eved nimkar Yosef, paraphrasing the book of Psalms. He says, sold as a slave, al yedei kinat echov, by virtue of the jealousy of his brothers. So by virtue of the jealousy of his brothers, Joseph is sold into slavery. And is it possible that a person who is sold into slavery by virtue of jealousy, Yukoshel boy, he should make the same mistake, giving Binyamin something different than the rest of his brothers, and that could easily cause jealousy. Now, you're going to say, hey, what do you mean? Why would that cause jealousy? How that? Because it did. Historically, there was a wardrobe malfunction, big time. The Omar Rava Bar Mechasya, and here we are quoting a Gemara which is found in Masechet Shabbat on page 10, side B. Rava, the son of Mechasya, taught Omar Rav Chama Bar Guria, and Rav Chama Bar Guria taught this in the name of Rav. Bishvil Mishkal Shnei Sloim Milas, for the value of $2, not a lot of money, of a little piece of fine wool, Shahosef Yankiv LeYosef, that Jacob added to Joseph's wardrobe, Misha'or Echav, more so than the rest of his brothers. Nizgalgal Hadover, one thing led to the next. A whole process began to unfold, domino effects. V'yardu avesenu l'Mitzrayim, and that caused our ancestors to make their way down into the land of Egypt. So the Gemara is saying, Yosef himself suffered on account of a difference made between brothers by virtue of nicer clothes, a greater wardrobe. And now, seeking reconciliation, trying to bring the family together, he makes the same mistake? Seriously? What in heaven could he have been thinking? And the Gemara says, this is why we went down into the land of Egypt. I want to finish the Gemara, just this piece, and then we're going to go back to this because we got problems, everybody. This is a very, very difficult piece of Gemara to understand. Omer Rabbi Binyamin bar Yefes. Rabbi Binyamin, the son of Yefes, said, well, you know why Yosef did this. It's because Remez Romazloi, he was alluding or hinting to Sha'asid ben Lotzeis Mimenu, that there would be a son, proverbially speaking, a great-great-grandson. In the Targum Sheni, on the Megillah, we have a whole genealogy that traces Mordechai Hayemini, which is really Binyamini, directly back to Binyamin, the son of Jacob. So Yosef was indicating to him that this son of yours, future progeny, just like 1,000 years later, make that. More like 13 centuries later or so, that son will leave milifnei hamelech, he will emerge from before the king, and he'll do so b'chamisha levushe malchus, with 5 royal raiments. Shenemar, for it is written in the 8th chapter of Megillat Esther, verse 15, Mordechai yotza b'levush malchus, Mordechai emerged in a raiment, a garment of royalty, tcheles, v'chur, etc., v'goymer. We hear about robes, and we hear about a golden crown, and we hear about a cape, a whole wardrobe, a royal wardrobe made up of 5 unique articles of clothing. That's what the Gemara says. Rashi says that there was a version that Yikoshel Boi included Vizare, that he and his future progeny would stumble in. Rashi says, no, that's not correct. Legasin Azar. This is not about future progeny, it's about Yosef. That's what the Gemara says. So when I was starting to look at this Gemara, try to prepare it, I had 2 problems. The first problem was to try to understand this Gemara. What was the question? What was the answer? Was there really the same reason for Binyamin's brothers to be jealous? I mean, could you really compare the stories? Would history repeat itself? So that was problem number 1. And there's pshat. There's lots of mefarshim. You can understand what the Gemara is saying. The bigger question I had is, why is the Gemara telling this to us? What relevance does it have to the story of Purim? So what if Yosef did something that may have influenced, or that may have been presaging the story of Purim? It's like he was alluding to a future event. Well, whoopee-doo. So what? At best, this belonged in the Gemara Masechet Shabbos. The Gemara Masechet Shabbat says that a person shouldn't make differences amongst his children. Why? Because, then you cause jealousy. In every situation, a person should try to make sure Al Yeshana Adam Ben Abanim, B'nai Ben Abanim. Don't single out one child from the others. Why not? What's wrong with having a favorite? Shebeshvil Mishkal Shnei Sloyim Milas, because of a couple of pennies, a couple of dollars worth of fine wool. Shanosan Yaakov le'Esav, Yosef, that Jacob gave to Joseph. Yosef Mishar Banim Niskanu Bei. They became jealous. V'nizgalgal lo hadavar. And one thing led to the next. V'yardav v'seinu l'Mitzrayim. So if the Gemara wants to understand or frame the actions of Yaakov as inappropriate, so we learn a lesson, would have been a perfect thing for the Gemara to say, oh, by the way, I mean, if this was not a good idea, Joseph didn't seem to have learned the lesson. And the Gemara could have responded, well, Joseph's a little different. I don't think anybody would have a problem. That's the way the Gemara is. The Gemara meanders. For whatever reason, the Gemara ended up speaking about Yaakov. So now the Gemara will challenge, really, it's an issue to do that? Yosef didn't think so. So we come back and say, you know what? He had a reason. How does it fit into the Gemara Megillah? We've been analyzing verses of the Megillah, page after page after page. Story after story, detail after detail. And this seems really to add nothing. So we're going to do two things. The first thing I'm going to do is try to tell you the pshat in the Gemara, to help you appreciate and understand why it's an issue. Why it's an issue. And then after we have pshat in the Gemara, then we'll try to address the second, I think, bigger question. What in heaven is the Gemara even trying to say? And in the end, we will walk away with an astounding understanding. I think, an astounding understanding of what's going on here. And it's really going to give you a wow. Okay, but let's start to understand pshat. So the first thing I think for pshat is, what do you mean he's going to be jealous? Why are they going to be jealous? So let's start over to Maharsha. The Maharsha in his commentary on our Gemara asks this very question. The Ikala Meidak, says the Maharsha, one could be precise or exacting. Like Dumya, there's no comparison. Vadai Gabe Yaakov, when you're talking about Jacob, he has many sons. None is more son or less son. He fathered them all. Kiven d'chulu vanov, since they're all his children. Im nosan le'echad mibanav yoser, if he gives one son more than the others, that's going to cause jealousy. Aval hocha, but here, kivan de Binyamin hayagam echov min ha'eim. Binyamin is more related, if you will, than the rest of the brothers. The other Shvatim are half-brothers sharing a common father. Binyamin is a full brother, sharing father and mother. So there's a reason. You're not allowed to love your brother more than somebody else. Could you imagine somebody comes along and he says, don't be nice to your brother because maybe your friends will get jealous. And I would say, well, he's my brother. So if he's my brother, that's why I'm nicer to him. Is it a sin to care more about family than somebody who isn't family? Some people would think it's a sin not to care about family. So for Yaakov, he has 12 sons. They're all sons in the same way. None are more his son or less his son. When he singled out Joseph, he singled out Benoi bein habonim. He made one son different than the rest. Joseph didn't single Binyamin out and make him different than the rest, insofar as his relationship with him is concerned. Joseph and Binyamin were actually closer. They were full brothers. So the Maharsha says, how could you even compare? What's the question? Yosef took care of his full brother a little bit more so than his half-brothers. You might be nicer to your first cousin than your second cousin. You might be nicer to your niece or nephew more than your first cousin once removed. Would that really be an issue? To favor one child over the other, understood. That's an issue. Don't do it. So this is the Maharsha's question. The Maharsha answers, via Shleimer. Here's a reasonable way to try and explain the words of our Gemara. Kivan de Yosef ba ata lahotzi hasina b'mechirasi. Since Yosef now comes to try to take down the temperature, it's very bad blood between these brothers. They try to kill him. They sold him into slavery. He hasn't seen them for over 2 decades. So he's trying to repair things. K'moisha Amar Le, as he says to them, Kishem she'em belibi sina, just as I have no hatred in my heart to Binyamin, I have no hatred to you either. He says, don't be afraid of me. So since that's what he was trying to do, because he was making the effort to try to show that he felt a relationship that was loving and didn't bear a grudge, so it just wasn't a good idea. Maybe they'll say, oh, look, Binyamin, he gives 5 suits to. Us, he gives 1. Maybe they won't say, well, he's, after all, full brother. But instead they'll say, oh, so he doesn't really love us that much. He loves us 1 suit. He loves Binyamin 5 suits. He loves them. He loves him more. Probably because he wasn't part of the sale. We were. He doesn't really love us. You know, if you love somebody, you give him 5 suits. If you don't love him, you give him just 1. In other words, the Maharsha, his question is, hey, this really isn't the same kind of situation. That's not a fair comparison. And his answer is, so what? The question isn't whether it's fair. The question is, was it wise? And it seems it wasn't. It was an unwise thing to do. Yosef is trying now to take down the angst, to dial down the bad blood. So why would you do things to create distinctions amongst the brothers when you're trying to create a family reunion? Now here's something really interesting. The Midrash tells us that why did Yosef give suits? He was sending them off to travel. He said, oh, by the way, you're going to be traveling on a dusty road. You should have a new, 3-piece suit. What do you need suits for? You schlep the suits to Canaan to come right back? Yosef could have said, I have you beautiful apartments for you guys. Don't worry about it. Beautiful homes. When you be back, I'll have the tailor's work. Suits will be waiting for you. The tailor is waiting to measure you. It's like a ridiculous question, but how did he know what their sizes are? How do you know what kind of suit they liked? I was thinking to myself, somebody comes to me and says, Rabbi, I bought you a suit. I'm like, I didn't ask you to buy me a suit. Maybe give me a gift certificate to buy myself a suit. I'll choose which suit I like. How do you know what suit I like? Usually people like to choose their own clothes. The whole thing is like odd. And then if you don't wear the suit you bought me, then I probably don't like the suit. You know how it is. This is strange. And of all things, he could have given out money. Oh, by the way, he did. He gave Binyamin money. The Gemara doesn't seem to talk about that. Money? Yeah, big deal. Suits. Now that's a problem. So the Midrash points out something very interesting. He gave them suits, lefi shakaru bigdeim, because they tore their clothes. Remember the story? It says in the Torah, when Yosef sent a posse after the brothers, having framed Binyamin as the thief, but nobody knows. And they catch up to the brothers and say, "How dare you? You repay kindness with such evil? My master is good to you, and you steal his magic goblet. You think he has no other magic ways of divining the future and knowing what happened? We had CCTV. We saw the whole thing." Oh, he didn't say that. You know what I'm saying. He also says, "I'm a master Sherlock Holmes. I figured this out." And the brothers say, "No, steal? Are you kidding? We don't steal. We're honest people." And they dismount from their camels and they throw the rucksacks down and they start to open up and they start with Ruvain, so nobody's suspicious, and they find it with Binyamin. And before they started, Yehuda said, "Nobody stole the goblet, and if somebody did, let him be a slave. We'll all be slaves." And then all of a sudden they find it with Binyamin. And Yehuda throws a fit. "Hey, you just said we'll all be slaves." But the Torah says they rent their garments. This is what Jacob was afraid of. That Binyamin would be detained by that crazed dictator, that viceroy prime minister who was out of control. And it happened. The nightmare was materialized. They all rent their garments. Then they're standing there with torn garments. Torn garments is like a shiva. So Yosef didn't want him to go home with torn garments. So he brought them new clothes. The Midrash says, "It wasn't nice for you to travel with torn clothes." The Midrash Lekach Tov frames it so sweetly. He says, "It is written, V'hafachti evlam l'sosin, I will change their mourning into happiness or rejoicing. V'nichamtem v'simachtem mi'yigonim, I will bring them joy from their agony." This is a verse that's found in the 31st chapter, the prophecies of Yirmiyahu and Navi Jeremiah, verse 13. So v'hafachti evlam. So it's like a switch. They came in a state of mourning. They're leaving in a state of joy. He also says it's like a new suit of clothes. It's like putting on a new set of circumstances. You came here in mourning, you leave in joy. So if this was about trying to fix things, replace the garments that were torn, so, I mean, this is like what you would call a functional gift. It's technical. Why give more to Binyamin? Especially if it possibly could be misinterpreted. Rabbeinu Moshe HaDarshan was one of Rashi's teachers, who Rashi quotes fairly often. He asks, why did he give them clothing? And he says, you know why he gave them clothing? Because he wanted to say, I don't have anything against you. I harbor no animosity whatsoever. They stripped him. Heim hivshituhu, says Rabbeinu Moshe HaDarshan. They stripped him. That's what the Torah says. They stripped him of his fancy coat that his father bought him, of the fine wool. As it says, Vayafshitu. This is back in Genesis chapter 37, verse 23. V'hu shilam lahem tova tachasra. They took his clothes away, and he gave them clothes. He repaid bad with good. Why? Because this was Yosef's opportunity. His opportunity not only to say in words, but in action, I forgive you. The Toldos Yitzchak, interestingly, it's a little bit of a longer commentary. He sews together, pun intended, the ideas of the Midrash and Reb Moshe Darshan. He says they were wearing torn clothes. And not only they were wearing torn clothes, but this was the perfect response. The polar opposite of the way they had treated him. The Paneach Raza goes into the details. He says it was like multiple suits of clothes. It wasn't just a shirt. And the Rambam's son, Rabbi Avraham, adds a fascinating nuance that I want to share. Rabbi Avraham, the son of the Rambam, says this. When Yosef was taken out of his prison cell, he was taken out of his prison cell to the Pharaoh's throne room because it was said that he could interpret dreams. So the Torah says, Vayachaleif simleisov. He rose to royalty on the wings of a wardrobe change. Honorable clothes. It was a way of conferring dignity upon Yosef. Clothes are called that which brings honor to its wearer. Clothing is more than just something to cover the subject. You could wear a sack. Just wrap a sheet around you. But beautiful clothing has style, flair, pizzazz. It makes you look good. Sometimes clothing is beautiful, but it's not beautiful on you. You need the right clothes and the right person. So Reb Avram says, when you want to raise a person's profile, clothing does it. What makes a bride so radiant? Is it not her attire? What makes the groom look so elegant? If not, the special wedding clothes. People spend a lot of money on clothes because clothes serve to complement them. There's a fascinating halacha that tells us that when people are in a court situation, we can't have them dressed differently. One wearing a $1,000 suit and the other coming in overalls. Incidentally, this biblical precedent is the origin of the way lawyers argue in court in Canada, in British parliamentary style, wearing robes so that they look the same. There's something about clothing. And the point is that the clothing that Yosef provided was supposed to make his brothers feel better. So if you're trying to make them feel better, why would you take a chance? You, Yosef, know better than anybody else how wardrobes can cause such malfunction or dysfunction. It was because Yaakov bought a finer article of clothing. It wasn't even such a big deal. You know, Rashi in Masechet Shabbat says, what was this article of clothing? Mishko Beis Loyim. So Rashi says that it's a little unlikely. It's a very, very funny fancy coat that cost just $2. There was inflation then too. 2 sloim didn't get you very far. So Rashi says, Lav dafka noket. It's a euphemism. It's like somebody saying, you would do that for $10? For a shirt? For a pair of socks? Come on. Hey, it's an expensive pair of socks. It cost me $40. Okay. It's a pair of socks. It's a few dollars. It's a euphemism. A few bucks, that's all it is. But Rashi himself is a little uncomfortable with that because the Gemara says $2. So Rashi quotes that the disciples of Rabbeinu Yitzchak HaLevi, they said that actually it wasn't very expensive. All it was a little bit of trimming on the edge. That kseinas pasim. A pas means on the pas yad, on the sleeve. It was a little extra hem. A little bit of fine wool. People used to wear that in certain Hasidic circles. They still have like a fancy piece of velvet. Just around, like the edges of the sleeves. So it was a little bit of extra wool, like a little ribbon. Well, they call He says that could have cost literally a few dollars. And for a little bit of trimming, Yosef had so much trouble. The Marsha says that it might have been like an overcoat, something very thin, very sheer. And maybe it was actually cheap, a little chiffon. It looked good, like a little tutu, whatever, It wasn't very expensive. But this really is not of overriding relevance. Was it a very fancy coat, not a fancy coat? The point, the Gemara is telling us, is that making distinctions specifically within a wardrobe made for a lot of trouble. It would have brought back a lot of bad memories. And if Yosef is trying to show his brothers that he forgives them, why would you create a situation that could possibly be misinterpreted, even if it's misinterpreted? At the end of the day, the facts don't matter. Because ultimately, it's people's truth that matters. This is the way they interpret it to be. It's not really true. True. But if that's their reality, then that's reality. And you have to deal with it. Especially if you're trying to get along with them. So if people are going to be offended, hurt, bent out of shape, or maybe end up gravitating in the wrong direction, then it wasn't a very smart thing to do. So the Gemara is saying, that wasn't a smart thing to do. Yosef himself knew more than anybody how it wasn't a smart thing to do. He suffered the brunt of that. And because of it, the Jewish people ended up in Egypt. Now this is a subject of tremendous contention. Because of that, they ended up in Egypt? Seriously? How could you say that? The Tosfos asks, how could you say Nizgalgal Hadover? V'yordu aveseinu l'mitzrayim. So the Tosfos says, one second. You're telling me that if not for the jealousy of Yosef's brothers, they wouldn't have ended up in the land of Egypt? That's not the way we heard the story. Says Tosfos, even though anyway, Nigzar, it was decreed that they should go down into Mitzrayim. The Chsiv, for it is written in the covenant of the parts that God arranged with Abraham, as detailed in the 15th chapter of the book of Genesis, that Hashem says to Avraham Avinu that your children will be strangers in a land that is not theirs. And they are going to be enslaved and tormented for 400 years. So the Gemara Tosfos answers, Shema, is it not possible that if not for Yosef's sale, maybe the Egyptian slavery wouldn't have been so bad? It was so bad because they were so jealous, because Yosef was the viceroy, because the Jews were living in Beverly Hills. You know how the anti-Semites start pointing fingers. The Jews. And because they came in the fashion or manner they came in, because they did a big sin by selling their brother. So therefore they suffered much more. Elal Yedezeh was only through this. Anyway, says Tosfos, you're forced to say that there was no 400 years in Egypt. No way that could be. Rashi makes a detailed calculation proving to you that it is patently impossible to suggest that. You take Moshe's years, you take Aaron's, his father Amram's years, and it doesn't add up. Kahas's years, it doesn't, no 400 years. And there were lots of years when they were living together. So what happened? So Tosfos says, Hischilu koidem shenolad Yitzchak Lamed Shana. The 400 years actually began 30 years before Yitzchak was born. The Maharshal goes to town on this Tosfos and he says there is a mistake here. The 430 years that is talked about in the Torah when the Jewish people leave Mitzrayim refer to 30 years before the Jewish people, before Yitzchak was born. It's supposed to be Misha Shenolad Yitzchak. The Pashtas, the Maharshal's emendation to Tosfos is accurate. At any rate, the Tosfos says something really bad happened. Something terrible happened. And Yosef knew the danger. This was a major malfunction. It brought so much horror, suffering, pain, difficulty, travail. Why take a chance? What are we doing? This very same question of didn't they have to go into Egypt anyway is also addressed by one of the great Sephardic Rishonim, the Ritva, Rabbeinu Yom Tov of Seville, and he says perhaps they wouldn't have gone to Egypt. Maybe they would have remained enslaved in Canaan. Maybe they would have had a difficult time. How do you know they would end up in Egypt? But they end up in Egypt because Joseph's in Egypt. Because there's a famine and he has to feed them. And he makes them come down. So the point is, something so bad happened. Why would Joseph not be more mindful? That's the question of the Gemara. Truth be told, it's a reasonable question. What's the Gemara's answer? So Rabbi Binyamin Bar Yefa says, there's a reason. Remez Ramazlai. He's trying to say something to him. He's trying to indicate that there's going to be a descendant of Binyamin who receives 5 articles of clothing at the climax of a miraculous kind of turnabout for the Jewish people. So the Maharsha says, the Ramazlai, he was alluding to them that Binyamin is being elevated to a special position with him. Because after all, he's a full brother. And just as Yosef, Rachel's son, rose to greatness and became the Jewish prime minister in a foreign land, a superpower of its time. The most dominant government, certainly in that part of the world. So too in the future, in the merit of Rachel, from our family, there will be another Jewish prime minister. A Jewish prime minister, not of a banana republic, of a global empire. And this Jewish prime minister, he also, it'll have something to do with special clothes. And the Maharsha says, so, but what about the money he gave him? What about the other things? So he says, well, they would understand already. This was a historical precedent. Yosef was linking his fortune with the fortune of Binyamin's future progeny. And they would realize that he was treating Binyamin differently because after all, they share the same mother as well as the same father. I mean, the question makes sense. The answer is a little strange. Remez, Ramaz, like, who needed this remez? What difference did it make? Like, I could still ask the question, was it really worth it? So the Maharsha is kind of saying, well, because he was alluding to a future event, it wouldn't have been misinterpreted. Not everybody is so quick to agree with that. The Pnei Moshe asks an interesting question. He says, we read in the Megillah that Mordechai, from his father's side, is descended from Binyamin, and from his mother's side, he comes from Yehuda. So the Pnei Moshe says, so he should have given Yehuda also 5 suits, because Mordechai comes from both tribes. From his mother Yehuda, from his father Binyamin. So the Pnei Moshe says, when it comes to being Jewish, we follow your mother. When it comes to yichus, to pedigree, we follow the father. Who is a Kohen? His father's a Kohen. Who is a Levite? His father's a Levite. Who is a Ben David, so to speak? Who is an heir to the throne in the Davidic royal line? A descendant, Ben Achar Ben. A patrilineal descendant. Who is a Jew? Somebody who comes from a Jewish mother or converted according to Allah. So, that's why there's a greater emphasis on Binyamin. But how would they even understand this? How would they not interpret that? They'll still be jealous. I mean, if you're worried about the possibility of something going wrong here, because of the symbolism and the representation, and because of what Yosef is trying to convey to his brothers, for heaven's sake, what are you taking this risk for? Like, is it really worth it? So there's a whole collection of Achronim, all of who asked this question. I'm going to, before I go to deal with the Achronim's questions, I'm going to see the questions here. Sharon is asking, who says the brothers knew what he was alluding to? Fantastic question. I'm going to answer that question. That, of course, is the big problem. And Janet, yes, you're welcome to email me a question. My email address is rabbi@chabadflamingo.com. Okay. So the Merume Sada says, there wasn't really a difference. He gave one set of clothes to older brothers, but that was a really fancy suit. That was like a $500 suit. And then he gave Binyamin 5 $100 suits. He gave them wool, and he gave Binyamin polyester. So there was no difference in value. They just had one nice suit, and he had 5, kind of suits, looking like suits. It's very hard to accept this answer. So actually he was dissing Binyamin. He was giving him less. I would rather have one nice wool suit than 5 polyester suits. The Iyun Yaakov, the Shnos Eliyahu, they're bothered by this. Like, come on, this it doesn't add up. They give him a cheap suit. That's going to help. So the Snei Yitzchak says that he gave everybody 5 suits. But by Binyamin, it was more noticeable. Really? Like what does that mean even? The Torah didn't record the 5 suits. He just gave the 5 suits. But the Torah records it because the Torah wants you to know. I don't even know what that means. Seriously. It's from great Torah scholars. I don't understand it. The only answer that perhaps answers Sharon's question is the Ben Yehoyada says, Ben Ish Chai says, he told them. He said, listen guys, I want you to understand what's going on here. I have this prophetic intuition. There's going to be a future event. Our people will be threatened. And it's his grandson. It's going to have a gewaldika, a wonderful miracle. And this is a holy moment. And I'm telling you guys, I'm giving him 5 suits, but it's an act of empowerment. And I'm kind of presaging what's going to unfold at a later point in Jewish history. And they think he's totally nuts. Or they think, wow, Joseph, you got your prophet hat on. Sure, okay. Or maybe they said, I don't know what he's talking about. But if he says, I don't know, I'm not a prophet. If he's a prophet, he says he's a prophet. He's a prophet. Okay, good. So he explained it to them so they weren't jealous. Is that it? Like, really? Like, how does that like really explain what happened here? Why was it so important to give him 5 suits? Don't give him the 5 suits. You know, it's like a joke you have to explain. It's never funny. He gave him 5 suits, but he explained to them, I want you to know I'm giving him the 5 suits because, and if he wouldn't give him 5 suits, Mordechai wouldn't save the Jewish people. Who needed this? So that's problem 1. It's hard to understand this Gemara. It's hard to understand the answer. What were our sages seeing here? But problem 2 is much bigger. The issue that I had, and you should have, I think. What in heaven is the Gemara trying to say here? What does this have to do with the story of Purim? Why is it being quoted in the midst of a collection of teachings that is hyper-focused on the Megillah and historical events that have a direct impact on the Megillah? This is a story that, okay, some things alluded to many centuries prior to the story. Okay. Like I said in the outset, if the Gemara in Masechet Shabbat had added this on, almost as like a question, you're telling me that you shouldn't al yeshane b'noi min abonim. You shouldn't single out one child and have a favorite. Then why did Joseph do it? And the Gemara could have answered, Joseph had a reason. Here in the Gemara Megillah. So this was driving me crazy. And then late last night I stumbled upon something and I spent today working on developing it, and I'm very excited to share it with you. I'm very excited to share this with you. I think this is like fantastic. All right, you ready? Fasten your seatbelts. Let's go back a couple of centuries. In the late 15th century, a great sage was born. And by the mid-17th century, he became one of the most famous Talmud teachers of his time. I only know him by the name of his book, actually. I'm embarrassed to say. I'll tell you what his name was. His name was Yonah. Yonah, the son of Rebbe Yeshayahu Te'umim, famous rabbinic family. He's born in like 1590s or something. Anyway, he wrote this fantastic commentary on the Gemara, Rashi, and Tosfos, as elaborated by Maharshal Marshal. And he named his book, which is commentary on the Gemara, Kikayon DeYonah. Kikayon is this tree that grows in the book of Yonah. And Yonah is very fond of his little tree that he didn't do very much to grow, but he knew him since he was that big. And then Hashem says, aha, so you're fond of a tree because you feel it's yours, and you want to know why I'm concerned with human life. That's just the story of the name of the book. So the Kikayon DeYonah says something absolutely wild, fascinating. He brings down the Gemara, and he says, Hakushya mefursemes. The question is famous. We all have the question. Mikol mokoim yekanu b'yechov. His brothers are going to be jealous anyway. It's not going to make a difference. So he had a reason. You're going to cause jealousy. You know how bad that jealousy was. You know how bad the last wardrobe malfunction. Why would you do another? And the Kikayon says, Venire bediktuk oid. As I'm getting more precise and exacting in my analysis, there's even a bigger problem I have. Ma ha'inyan romas bekan. What in heaven's going on over here? I'm like, I feel so good. The Kikayon had my questions. I have the Kikayan's questions. It's obvious questions. You don't have to be a big luminary, a big scholar. These are obvious questions. The Kikayon says, Mefursemes, what is this all about? But he says something extraordinary. And what the Kikayon does is create what's called in the language of Talmudic conversation. He creates a mahalach. You know, like mahalech, halicha, to go. He gives us an approach, a way. And I took the Kikayon's road, and I went further. I went very far because he doesn't offer that much. It's just a few short sentences. But to be fair, I mean, I'm just going on the Kikayon was my inspiration here. And maybe he knew all this and much more. But he wrote a few lines. This is the mahalach, this is the direction that he sets us off in. I'm telling you, this is gewaldig. He says, you want to understand what's going on over here? Look at the Midrash. Look at the Yalkut. Now the Yalkut is a reference to Yalkut Shimoni. It's like an 11th century Midrashic work, compilation of Midrash, which we know is solid. It's got a seal of approval. And I found it in the Midrash Rabbah too. And he says, the Midrash tells us, V'hamelech v'haman yashvu lishtos. When the verse tells us the king and Haman sat down to drink. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu. God said to the Shvatim, the tribes of Israel, Atem machartem es achechem mitoich Michael umishte. You sold your brother. And then you sat down to have lunch. Shenemar, as it is written, Vayeshvu lecher lechem. It's one of the saddest verses in the whole Torah. They sold a brother into slavery. And they sat down to have a hearty lunch. Harei Haman ba v'yilakecheschem mitoich Michael umishte. Haman will come and he will take you down. And he'll do it over lunch. Shenemar v'hamelech v'haman yashvu lishtos. The king and Haman, after signing the documents that want to see, sat down to lunch. They signed the legal documents that would ensure the 1,000,000 of murders. and then they had a hearty lunch. That was the story of Haman and Achashverosh. It happened many centuries later in Wannsee. They approved the protocols, wrote into law the murder of millions, and then sat down for lunch. And the Midrash later says, Mordechai yoda es kol asher nasa. Mordechai became aware of everything prophetically. The Midrash says that he had a recurring nightmare that he now saw coming true. And he knew what must be done l'refuas hamakeh. He knew what has to be done to remedy the situation. Venire, the Kikayon says, it's brilliant, holy insight. He says, it seems, the Mikoyach Shahoisa Avera the Mechiras Yosef Gormol Lekichas Haman. The plot of genocide against the Jewish people evolved out of the sale of Yosef. V'lachein, and as such, Hayta Hachua al Yedei Mordechai. The salvation could be brought through Mordechai. Ki hu mizera Binyamin, because he is a descendant of Binyamin. Binyamin lo yehoya b'mechiras Yosef. Binyamin is the only brother who didn't participate in the sale of Yosef. V'lachein romaz remez asher yetsa b'Mordechai mimenu. He said, lo yukanu, don't be jealous, guys. Yes, he was different. He wasn't part of that. And as such, he will be able to save you. That's the Kikayon's approach. Let's take a look at the Midrashic Shimoni. Valet, this is going to get even more powerful. This is powerful. This is going to get absolutely unbelievable. The Midrashic Shimoni says, Man de Omar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Vatron. Anybody who says that God just overlooks things. Levater is to forgive. It's okay. Don't worry about it. Debt paid. Whoever says that, Yivosru me'ohi, may his intestines give out or loosen. Ella, what does God do? Ma'arich ruche v'govi delay. He delays his anger, but in the end, the bill must be paid. The bill must be paid. The sin does not simply disappear. It is not forgiven and forgotten. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu l'shvatim. You see it right here. God proverbially said to the tribes, you sold your brother and had lunch? It says, Vayeshvu lecha lechem, Haman bava lekecheschem. He'll take you out of Michael Amashta. And then the Midrash goes on to describe how when a Jew, during the year between Haman's decree and the miracle, actual day of deliverance of Purim, how a Jew would go and try to buy some food, some vegetables in the market. And the local anti-Semite would come and choke him and say, you're dead meat. Soon I'm going to kill you. Why bother eating? Rabbi Yitzchak from Akku said, imagine this. Yosef forgave his brothers. Uma Yosef shemochel. Va'omar lo yatem. It wasn't you machartem. You didn't sell me. I was sent here. Elikim shlachoni. Re'ei ad heichan hi hakina. And see how bad the jealousy was. Misha eni moichel. A person who doesn't forgive. How much more so? It's a powerful Midrash. The Yalkut Shimoni that the Kikayon quotes says that Mordechai knew exactly what was happening because he had a recurring nightmare. And in his nightmare it says, this is the dream I've been having since Achashverosh rose to the throne. In the dream, V'hine rash v'rad chazak ma'od. There's a tremendous tumult. There's a disturbance. Kol b'hola, al pnei kol haaretz. Everybody is overwhelmed. And two sea serpents, or dragons, are coming, one against the other. Battle of the Titans. And everybody flees from the sound of this clash. And amongst these massive dragons, these monsters, there's a little nation. And all the nations gather up on this little nation to destroy him. And then, on that day, there are black clouds. It's a terrible storm. And this little nation cries out to God. And the dragons or sea serpents have a ferocious, brutal battle. And then Mordechai sees this little stream of water. And the stream turns into a gulf, a large river. And it separates the dragons and it creates this calm atmosphere. This is his nightmare. And Mordechai understood what happened. He said, this is what it's all about. So the Kikayon says, this is the story. This is what Yosef's talking about. Now in the Medrash Rabbah, it's almost verbatim. We almost have the same thing. I wanted to point out a few little things. First of all, the business of whoever says HaKadosh Baruch Hu is a vatron. The Medrash says, if you say God is loose, so to speak, looses his grip, may your intestines loosen. What does that mean, by the way? What does it mean to have v'yaturan b'nei ma'ohi? So the Matnas Kahuna suggests it means, God forbid, to miscarry, to have a stillborn, your innards empty out. The other Mefarshim, they say it's not a good thing. It's like, it's not like, oh, you think God forgets? No problem, that's cool. It's not correct. Now, when I was preparing this class today, B'Hashgacha Pratis, a member of our shul sends me an interesting thing that he saw in next week's parsha. He sent it to me in English, but I like looking up at the Hebrew original. So, the Me'am Lois in Parshas Kisisa speaks about the 13 attributes of mercy. And he asks a question. This is the Me'am Lois in Parshas Kisisa. It's page 1275. Tov Shunayin. 1175, sorry. So he says like this. V'yesh lechem lishol. You could ask a question. We said that God made this covenant. Kol zman sheYisrael eimenim yud gimel midas elu. Whenever the Jewish people say these 13 attributes, b'shas saram, in a time of their difficulty, ein tfilasam chezeres reikam, then their prayers don't come home empty-handed. Excuse me. We see many times that we said, Yud Gimel me this, and we did all the tachnunim, and we're not answered. So the Mamloyas quotes the Tzedel Derech, and he says, Aleichem Ladas, Shezeh She'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu, when it says Hashem made this covenant of 13 attributes of mercy, Shem Yu Lechem Harbe Avonos, if you have a large volume of sin, a lot of sins, if he can't answer everything, you get an answer. So the English translation said, God never fully forgives the sin. I don't know where they got that from. I don't see that in the Hebrew, but the Midrash actually says that. I didn't have a Tzedel Derech to look, so I didn't have a chance to look in the Tzedel Derech. But the point is that Yosef knew that the Jewish people were going to be in big trouble because they sold him. Not because he will be angry, but because Hashem is going to be angry. Did you ever notice that the whole story of Yosef and his brothers is always about clothing? Yosef's father makes him a fancy coat. They strip him of his fancy coat. And then later, Reuven ends up in some big trouble. And eventually, after he's been taken away from the rest of his brothers, he has a strange tryst with Tamar. And what happens then? Tamar says, you have a credit card? He says, no, I don't use plastic. Oh, she says, oh, how do I get paid for my services? He says, here's collateral. What does he give her? He says, Vatoymar, he said, Mohayrov, and she said, Asher etin loch. Vatoymar, she said, I'll tell you what you should give me. Chaysamcha ufsilecha. Give me your seal, and give me your patil. Your patil means your thread. So what is that? So Rashi says, Chotamcha upsilecha is kascha, signet ring. It's like a fingerprint, signature those days. That was the signature, the imprinture that we make in clay. Vishushivcha. What does that mean? Tabat sha'ata chosimba, the ring, the signet ring that you sign your deals with. V'simlascha sha'ata miskasaba, and your unique article of clothing. So the Rebbe once asked, if it's clothing, it should have said that. Why don't you say, Chaysamcha v'levushacha? Why do you say your seal and your thread, your threads? And Rashi makes like the lie hair to this. He says, look in the Targum, right? Targum says, Iskasecha v'shushivcha. Tabas sha'ata chosimba v'simlascha sha'ata miskasa. Like, what's up with the circuitous, superfluous language? So the Rebbe says the answer is simple. Tamar wanted to have something that was unmistakably Yehuda. What would it be? His signet ring. Nobody else has your password. Nobody else has a signet ring. And she wanted your threads. She wanted the beged hamiyuchad. She wanted not an article of clothing. A jacket's a jacket. How do you know it's my jacket? No, Reuven. I want your special jacket. This was unique to Reuven. Just like his thread, he had a special robe he wore. Simlascha sha'ata miskaseba, your article of clothing. Like our sages tell us that at tzitzit was a talit. Lo yabeged herogol. The Rebbe says not the regular clothes. Beged miyuchad, the special clothes. Shalavash Yehuda laot chashivut, that Yehuda wore because he was considered the king amongst his brothers. Yosef is made distinct by virtue of his clothes. His clothes are taken from him. Yehuda has his clothes taken from him in poetic justice. Yosef ends up in a prison cell. As soon as he's taken out, there's a change of clothes. And then Yosef gets royal clothes. The Midrash points out who caused who caused the brothers to tear their garments. The Midrash says, Mordechai yodes kol asher nasa. What did Mordechai do? Vayikra Mordechai is begodav. Mordechai tore his clothing. And he tried to get everybody else to tear their clothing in tshuva as well. Binyamin goram l'shvatim likroya. Binyamin caused his brothers because when they arrested Binyamin, they framed him. The brothers tore their clothes. Do you see a pattern emerging? There's a tapestry here. Every single time there's something about the clothes. All right. So this is my little chiddush. This is my novelty here. I would like to propose to you that what we learned in this Gemara is perfectly in line with what we learned in the Gemara last episode, and 2 episodes, and 3 episodes, and 4 episodes ago. It's all following the same pattern. There is a fundamental problem here in the Megillah, and the fundamental problem is this. In verse 14, it says that a second order was sent, an edict that stated clearly that the Jewish people would be allowed to rise and to defend themselves. And then in verse 14 it says, that's verse 13. In verse 14 it says that there was riders, the Persian Pony Express was set into motion, and the law was set in Shushan, the capital. Verse 15, and Mordechai emerged wearing a lot of fancy clothes. Verse 16, La Yehudim, Hayta'ora, V'simcha, V'sason, V'yikar. For the Jewish people, there was light and glory and happiness. And everywhere where the message was coming, the Jewish people were rejoicing and happy, and it was a Yom Tov, and everybody was getting inspired by the Jewish people. So which verse isn't like any other? Verse 15. What difference does it make if Mordechai came out wearing these clothes and that clothes? Who cares if Mordechai had a crown? It's not about Mordechai's success. This is about the salvation of the Jewish people. Verse 13, an edict is issued. The Jewish people will defend themselves. Imagine that. Verse 14, the message goes out, the Persian Pony Express, there really was such a thing, was activated. Verse 16, joy. Happiness. The clouds have lifted. Verse 16, it's infectious. Everybody's happy. That's in 16 and 17. Verse 15, Mordechai Yotza. What is this? Who cares? Why is it even part of the story? In what way does this tell the story of the miracle of Purim? This is the question. That is the issue. That's what bothers our sages. Now, typically, when our sages would analyze a verse, they would either note some kind of grammatic anomaly, something strange syntactually. Here, there's nothing really wrong with this verse. It's just bland. It's not saying anything. By the way, that's not my observation. The Manas Halevi, the Al-Kabatz, in his commentary in the Megillah, he says exactly this. He says, what difference does it make? Who cares? And the Al-Kabatz answers, that's because in Shushan itself, where the people were so close to the king and Haman and his friends, an edict didn't make the difference. They didn't really believe it. They were still very anti-Semitic. What changed? When they saw Mordechai wearing royal clothing, walking around with a gold crown, they were wowed. They said, oh, this is serious. The Jewish people really do have the power on their side. And so, Rabbi Misyadim, they began to embrace Jewish ideas and ideals, and they said, yeah, we want to be part of this. The visual of Mordechai emerging triumphant played a huge role in the turnabout. But how do we know that this played a huge role? How do we know that this is even part of the miracle, that it was an issue? It's interesting, the Mefarshim say that Haman yearned for that crown. Oh, he wanted to wear a crown. In fact, Achashverosh said, Haman, what should the king do for somebody who wants to show honor and dignity? What should happen to the man whom the king wishes to glorify? And Haman thought, that's me. And he said, let him wear a crown. Let him wear royal robes. Let everybody see him dressed resplendently. And the king said, it's fantastic. Do that for Mordechai. Haman said, what? Haman wanted this all along. Some of the Mefarshim suggest Haman could be honored with a party. Mordechai only ate kosher food. He wasn't going to drink wine with the king. The king had no choice. Food wouldn't do it, so he turned to clothing. You can honor somebody with food or honor somebody with clothing. That was the miracle. And when the king did that, and when the people in Shushan, the capital city where the battle was much, much more pitched and much more difficult, it took 2 days to mop up in Shushan until we got every last one. When the people in Shushan saw Mordechai, Yotza Melefnei HaMelech, B'levush Malchus, Tcheles, V'chur, V'aterezov, Gedele, V'sachrich, Butz, V'gamon, the whole jazz, they said, oh, this is real. And only then, Ha'ir Shushan, Tzahala V'samecha, then there was joy in Shushan. Everybody rejoiced. And La Yehudim Hayta Ora V'simcha V'sasam V'yikar. How do we know this is important? How do we know that verse 15 is actually pivotal, that it's key? How do we know that this is a major part of the story? Why is it a major part of the story? That's exactly what the Gemara is telling us. It's a major part of the story. It's such a major part of the story. Yosef HaTzadik risked everything to be able to demonstrate to his brothers that despite the fact that they had committed a terrible sin, and that he fully forgave them, that ultimately there would be trouble in the future as a result, but Binyamin's descendants would be there to save the Jewish people. Jealous? They could only have been thankful. And this goes back to what the Ben Yehoyada said. Yosef explained it to them. He said, guys, I forgive you. We bear now a heavy burden. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is not a vatran. He doesn't forget. And then the fascinating thing is, I was looking into this week's Parsha, Parshas Tetzaveh in the Midrash. And it says, what caused Mordechai to rise to greatness? And the Midrash says what caused Mordechai to rise to greatness is, as we learned just 2 episodes ago, after Mordechai rode a high horse, it didn't get to his head. How do we know that? It says, Vayoshav Mordechai. What did our Gemara tell us? Chazer l'sakei u'letanisoi. He put on his torn clothing again. Maksiv Acharov, it says, Vayoshav Mordechai Shara Melech Shechazer l'sakei u'letanisoi. And this is the meaning of the prayers that Mordechai offered, and that was the tshuva he did. So in the end, clothes sometimes kind of make a man. It's a story of torn clothes and beautiful clothes. It's a story of the evolution of history. I believe in evolution. Not that we were evolved from orangutans. That's ridiculous, in my opinion. Hashem created us all in our individual species. The Torah says so clearly. But we are the recipients of what has happened before us. And Jewish history is evolutionary. And what evolved from the sale of Yosef was the near annihilation of the Jewish people. But a set of clothes demonstrated that it was the son of Binyamin who did not participate in this sin, who was able to rise to the moment and save the Jewish people. And I was thinking, it's like this terms in the Gemara, Ein chovish materes atzmai. If your hands are tied, you can't untie your own knots, but somebody else can. Binyamin wasn't tied up in the same situation, the same circumstances. And we see here this stunning sweep of Jewish history, this extraordinary tapestry of how our circumstances are evolved out of things that happened in the past. But Hashem always gives us the Torah leadership and the strength that we need in the right time. You know, we may be facing stormy times, but we have the strength because we are the recipients of thousands of years of history and holiness, of a Torah tradition that can uplift and inspire, of merits of past ancestry that can lift us and carry us forward as we make it across the final cloudy moments. And Emirtz Hashem, B'mheiro B'yameinu, see the grandson of David HaMelech emerge resplendent in the royal crown and resplendent robes of Mashiach, B'mheira U'B'yameinu, speedily and in our days. Thank you so much for joining tonight. It was an honor to teach and share Torah ideas with you. Please be so kind as to like, share, and let's get more people to subscribe and build our channel. youtube.com/Rabbi Mendel Kaplan is the way you can do it. The more Torah we study, the more messages of positivity and holiness we spread. The closer we come to that great day, may it be B'mheira U'B'yameinu. Amen. Thank you.